Welcome everyone to the Bent by Knowledge podcast, where we will dig into what current research and the Bible actually have to say about exercise and good nutrition. All right, welcome back everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Today I am so excited to be talking with one of my old colleagues and specifically about the conversation today around resistance training. So most of you guys know, everybody in my life knows that I like to pick up heavy things and put them down. And I know that you, Joey Carzoli, also do. And so today's topic we'll get into in a little bit, but we're really going to be talking about resistance exercise and some of the benefits and the adaptations. But I would love to start by having Joey Carzoli introduce himself. And I always say, tell us why or who you are and what makes you the person to talk about resistance exercise training.
Okay. So I, as Britt said, I'm Joey Carzoli. I'm currently a PhD candidate in neurophysiology at CU Boulder. I did my undergraduate and master's degrees in exercise science at Florida State University and Florida Atlantic University, respectively. At FSU, I had the privilege of meeting Britt Allman, and she helped me tremendously with my undergraduate thesis there. I worked under Dr. Michael Ormsby there, and he had the insight to basically task Britt with reading and editing endlessly and probably painstakingly for her my undergraduate thesis. So that's kind of where we go back, and which I was very appreciative of because we eventually got that published, which was kind of the beginning of my kind of journey as a scientist. And as far as why I'm the guy to talk to about resistance training, I mean, that's a lofty claim there. Don't know if I'd make that myself, but maybe compared to some, I guess I've really taken the time to try to study and perfect lifting technique for some of the power lifts. I was former president and head powerlifting coach for the FSU weightlifting club. Again, kind of with my research background and active research in resistance training. I've not only read a lot, but learned a lot actively doing the research myself. And then what's actually been pretty fun is now kind of switching, not entirely switching fields, but taking a little bit of a shift from exercise science to neurophysiology has really opened my eyes to a lot more that needs to be considered when it comes to human performance and kind of what maybe is really happening on the neuro side as opposed to just the muscle side, which I'm sure we'll probably get into a little later here.
Yeah. And well, first off, you're definitely the person to talk to about this, just based on all the credentials you said, you humble man. But yeah, and back to the FSU.
Lifting weights.
Yeah, you're really good at lifting weights. I was always shocked when I would come into the powerlifting gym. You're not the biggest guy. You're not a small guy, but you're not the biggest guy. And you were lifting these crazy heavy weights. And I was like, how does he do that?
Well, thank you. One thing that was funny was I remember when I poked my head into Dr. Ormsby's office to ask if I'd be able to help with any research. And he didn't recognize my name, but when I said I was the kind of the president of the weightlifting club, he goes, "Oh, are you the guy that squats a lot?" And I was like, "Yes, my reputation has preceded me. This is great."
Yes.
Never felt more complimented in my life. Yeah.
Right. Especially from Mike Ormsby.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Meanwhile, he's super jacked. And I was just like, yeah, coming from you, this means so much. I didn't mention this before, but I'm also a certified strength and conditioning specialist, which I would say doesn't inherently mean someone definitely knows what they're talking about, but it's a pretty good credential to have that shows like, okay, they might have a good understanding overall. And I think that beyond kind of certifications and stuff like that, what comes down to making someone pretty knowledgeable is, are they actually actively doing the work, helping people lift, exercise, train one way or the other, and learning kind of through experience what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's great too. But yeah, we have published a paper that was your undergraduate thesis was not awful, and you were the first person that I mentored ever, and it was such a good experience. And I mean, you can give like a little elevator pitch, but basically what you did is you had people bench press, and you had experienced people in lifting, and then you had novices that weren't as great at lifting. And then you looked at this scale of perceived exertion, and you can talk more about it. Go ahead. Give me
Yeah,
an
no, that's exactly right. And so essentially we're looking at how well do experienced lifters and novice lifters accurately rate how difficult a bench press attempt was for them compared to if they failed or not. And so we looked at not only if they were doing a 1 repetition maximum attempt, but at a few sub-maximal sets underneath that. What were the differences in how they might rate the difficulties of those sets? Essentially, kind of the take-home message of our findings was more experienced lifters more accurately and correctly rated an RP of 10, which is the maximum on the scale, when they were doing their 1 rep max attempt. Whereas the novice lifters more often would hit, say, maybe a 9 or an 8, which those would respectively mean they think they had 1 more rep left in the tank or 2 more reps left in the tank. So they would rate under 10, essentially thinking they could do more reps or more weight, and then they would fail on their next attempt of a small weight increase. And so what was kind of funny was it just kind of goes to show that learning more about yourself as a lifter and your capabilities comes with experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, it was such a cool study too. I loved it. But in that same vein, we're going to talk about weight training today. And of course, I like I said before, I love to lift. I was just lifting today, and I lifted 2 days ago, and I deadlifted for the first time, and I thought of you. But I deadlifted for the first time in a while. But I really wanted the approach of the conversation today to start by talking about where to find exercise information with regard to weight training, because I think that the information can be everywhere and you never know what source that you can trust. And then what to do and how to start lifting. And then from there, we can really dig into some of the adaptations from strength training. I think a lot of people, in particular women or people that are more body composition or body image sensitive, are deterred away from weightlifting a little bit more, just because I think cardio can be of more benefit. So I'd love to talk about some of the strength adaptations, and then any other cool adaptation, in particular, some of the stuff that you're learning right now, maybe some of the neuro stuff. So I am excited. Let's begin. First, like I mentioned, the world of fitness information can be all over the place, and everybody and their mom is a professional. That's what they would say. But the truth is, you can't get legitimate information about weight training from just anywhere. Like if you went on Google and if you type in resistance exercise, I'm sure that 1,500 YouTube videos would come up. Google would populate a search of like 70,000. And so I wanted to hear from you what your advice for people would be to properly weed through that information, and what should they sort of siphon out.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that my master's mentor, Mike Zordos, told me long ago, as he likes to say, is the internet is the best thing to happen for exercise, and the internet is the worst thing to happen for exercise.
Huh.
It's tough because there are so many sources of information out there, and it's not always clear which ones should be taken seriously. And that's even harder to judge for someone who's just getting started in lifting weights. My first recommendation for the average person would be to look up reviews of a personal trainer in your area. Find one that seems to cater to your training interests, whether that's lifting weights or weight loss or some other goal, and give personal training with that individual a shot. That way you'll have guidance from someone more knowledgeable than you, and you can learn the basics from them. Additionally, as far as kind of like weeding out more bad sources, I would say steer clear of the YouTube ads of some muscular guy with his shirt off whose opening line has to do with supplements. And then on top of that, actually, I would say don't worry about any dietary supplements for probably the first year of lifting weights or most forms of exercise. Plenty of my friends' first questions when they started lifting weights was, what supplements should I take? Not, am I lifting correctly, or do I have good technique or anything like that? But it was, what supplement should I take? And I understand why this would be one of their first questions. And it's probably because a lot of ads would lead us to believe we can't get stronger or in better shape without consuming some mystical powder every day. And fortunately, that's not the case. We can still make great progress in all forms of exercise without supplements. Although there are some that are beneficial to take, but I'd say hold off for the time being as you're still just learning general exercise technique.
Yeah, and I think that's great advice too, because in general, I mean, if you're trying to make a sustainable change, if you pile too much on in the beginning, you can be overwhelmed. So just getting to know the basics and then maybe as you adapt, adding stuff in. I think that's great advice. But to back it up even further, I think it's really important to be able to know and define what resistance exercise actually is. And in terms of recommendations, how much we should get before we go any further. So can you define resistance training and then talk about recommendations?
Sure. Yeah. So resistance training is simply doing some form of exercise in which you have to move or support a load, with the purpose being to increase strength. How much resistance training we are recommended to get varies from one source to another. Personally, as kind of a general guideline, I think a minimum of twice a week of moderate to high effort strength training is a good goal for most people. And that can definitely change as our physical capabilities change, as well as our time availability. So we can kind of adjust some of those, our frequency and how much effort we're putting forth, to based on our life situation in that time.
I think you're definitely right about that. The general recommendation for overall health, like decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, is to get 2 sessions in per week. So I think along those lines, that's definitely a great place to start.
And one thing I'll say on top of that is, we can always have, like, it's great when we set goals and are able to stick to them. It's really detrimental when we set goals and can't. And so, especially for someone just starting off, we might be pretty rah-rah and gung-ho and think like, all right, 6 days a week, I'm going to start lifting weights for the first time ever. That's probably not sustainable very early for most people. And so I'd say probably some type of kind of that minimum goal of twice a week. All right, Monday and Thursday, 5 p.m., I'm going to train with my personal trainer or something like that is, I think, a more realistic goal for people to jump into resistance training and actually be able to stick with it from there.
Yeah, I mean, you want people to be able to walk too. So
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, you're not able to recover as quickly as early on when you start lifting weights. And so when you first start lifting, you'll probably be very, very sore and very, well, not to scare anyone away, you'll be fairly sore, but the soreness will kind of remind you that you're accomplishing something great and pushing yourself, and it's good, right? And that sensation of the soreness kind of wears off over time as your body becomes better and better at recovering quicker.
for sure, for sure. So, okay, we've defined weight training and how much you should get, but um, I do want to dig into what are some of the ways that you can do resistance training, because I think some people might hear resistance training and they automatically think that they need to get under a heavy bar, but that may not be the case. There are different mediums or different ways to go about weight training. So what type of equipment could you use or do you need?
Yeah, strength training can be done with a variety of equipment. And I mean, I personally think the most satisfying form is free weights like barbells and dumbbells. Although you can definitely use machines. TRX is pretty popular. You can use resistance bands. There's really no shortage of ways you can do some form of resistance training, even body weight stuff. But people gravitate towards different interests. And like I suggested earlier, I recommend seeking a more experienced trainer to help show you the ropes of whatever specific form of resistance training you're most interested in. And regardless of whatever equipment you're using, the most important focus, especially early on, should be perfecting your technique to the point where it becomes reliably safe and consistent and pretty much habitual, regardless of whatever equipment you're using. And one thing I'll say is that plenty of people, I've heard a lot of people say that, like, you can start off on machines before you jump into free weights. In my experience, I think people sometimes it can be good to just experience trial by fire and maybe just jump into the free weights a little earlier if you think you have someone that can instruct you well and properly. I don't necessarily think that free weights are like a hard stepping stone on your way to free weights. I'm sorry, machines are a hard stepping stone on your way to free weights. They can help as far as maybe just getting used to doing resistance training for the first time. But I would say most people's goal shouldn't be solely to just stick with machines forever. There are a lot of benefits that free weights create, of just like whole body stabilization being a big requirement that you're usually going to miss if you just stick with machines.
And I love that. And I totally support that statement too. I think because it can be intimidating, a lot of people want to start with the machines. And I think that's okay if they want to build a little bit of, mental strength through it. And in fact, I think machines are really good at isolating specific muscles because you are, like you said, sort of taking away the need for stabilization. So if somebody has never weight trained before, it might be a good idea to start maybe the first couple weeks in the circuit. But yeah, throw them into the fire, maybe do a set with dumbbells and help force them to work on normal movement patterns rather than a fixed movement pattern like you would see on a machine. Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah, I think that free weights definitely create kind of a more, I'd say, better all around adaptation for the whole body, as opposed to just the isolated muscle the machine is focusing on.
Mm-hmm. Now, with things like going in there and knowing how many repetitions to do and sets to do and how much rest you should get between and all this stuff like weight and all that. If I'm brand new to lifting, what is the best recommendation that you can give to set up a program for, actually programming your lifting in?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. It's a pretty big question because a lot of research has gone into that. And generally, for beginners, those variables of how long should you rest in between sets, how many sets should you do, how many reps should you do at what kind of intensity, is not too important for novices until they start to get a little bit more experience under their belt and can really kind of start to push themselves and get a better understanding of their capabilities. However, I do think it can be helpful gaining experience lifting, say, heavier weights for fewer reps and lighter weights for more reps while still in a novice phase of training. So what that could look like would be on one day, someone lifts 4 sets of 4 repetitions at a fairly difficult weight. Let's say we're squatting because, that's the best. And then another day later in the week, say, first day was Monday, second day could be Thursday. Maybe they lift 4 sets of 8 repetitions at a lighter weight. And those weights, obviously just relative to each other. So I think that can be pretty beneficial just to see, all right, how difficult does lifting feel with these different weights, and what are kind of good rep ranges for each individual person for a given weight. From there, the general guidelines recommended for focusing on increasing strength are to perform sets of fewer repetitions, and these guidelines can kind of vary, but like fewer repetitions, maybe like 3 to 5 reps with heavier weights. If you were going to go kind of off of percentages of 1 rep maxes, it could be anywhere from like 80 to 95% or so. But especially if you're a novice, that guideline might not really mean much. So I would say what's really important kind of while you are still learning how to lift for the first time is to just get a good understanding of, all right, this is a difficult weight to lift, but I can lift it with good technique. And I'm confident I can lift it for 3 to 5 reps with good technique and without deviating from my ideal form. So that's kind of like the general guidelines for gaining strength. The other guidelines for maybe say hypertrophy or increases in muscle size are to lift more reps with a lighter weight. So maybe 8 to 12 reps at like a moderate difficulty weight. And then for focusing on like muscular endurance, to lift even more reps, so maybe 12 to 20 or so at even lighter weights. Generally, it should be kind of obvious that the heavier the weight, the fewer reps you'll be able to lift it for. And then kind of in the end, muscle size and muscle strength go hand in hand. So if you increase one, you will likely increase the other. There are some situations where it's not a perfect one-to-one like progression in both, but the types of sets and rep schemes we train most often, so whether that's heavier weights for fewer reps or lighter weights for more reps, are usually the types of sets and reps we simply get better at performing and more comfortable with.
Yeah. And I definitely want to circle back a little bit to The best way I think to work on strength training as a novice, like you said multiple times, is to go by how you feel when you're doing the set, because I think we can really get bogged down as beginners and saying, I only have 10 pounds on this bar, and you get a little self-conscious and all that stuff. So, I mean, you could blanket the weight altogether and just go by how you feel, because um, weight training should be difficult. I think a lot of people don't understand that I think I'll say I work with a lot of researchers that don't understand exercise, and they don't understand that it should be hard. And I mean, because if you want to increase your muscle mass, you're going to have to really stress your muscle. And so really understanding the feeling behind it and going back to the paper that we published together, that's what it's about. It's the rate of perceived exertion. So how you feel you're exerting yourself. And so in thinking about that, if you were to talk to a novice, somebody new to weightlifting, if I were to look at let's say my set, my exercise set, I'm doing a set of squats. What on that scale, let's say it's a 0 to 10 scale, what are they sort of looking for by the last rep or overall throughout that set?
So, and this is kind of tough because I would say, I think, especially for like a true novice who maybe it's just in like the first few weeks of lifting and they're really still just trying to learn their technique. And I would say that even if you're not a novice, you should still always be focusing on perfecting your technique and fine tuning it to make it ever better and ever better. But especially when you're just learning, basic technique and motor patterns for these lifts, I think that the most difficult aspect of lifting weights should be doing it with correct technique, not the weight itself. And so it's kind of like only once you've maybe gotten, a few weeks in, and hopefully someone with a trained eye that is like, yeah, this is looking good and has helped you get your technique to where it should be, could you maybe start dabbling in like lifting and like, all right, let's push the weight up a little bit and see how things feel. But as far as kind of that RP scale, or like, and we could kind of just say like on a general 0 to 10 scale, like how difficult should something be? I would say, especially if you're in kind of the first month or two of lifting weights, maybe don't go above a 6 or 7, just because as you get closer and closer and to like the high end of that scale, and you start to kind of exert yourself more, technique is more and more likely to break down. And it takes a lot of time and practice to really ingrain technique that is not going to break down under heavy weight. So like the goal is like, if you ever fail, it shouldn't be because you had a technique error. It should be because you're simply not strong enough. And that's really, really tough to like get to. And it takes so much practice. And it's something that I learned kind of the hard way on the FSU Weightlifting Club was, I had my fair share of injuries because I was, some 20-year-old kid and was just like, yeah, lift weights all the time. No problem. Don't, just push yourself. You have a little form breakdown, no big deal. And then you get super injured and you're like, oh, this stinks. So that kind of opened my eyes to how valuable it is to really just take the extra time to just drill your technique. Actually, at this one gym I was lifting at for a couple of months, I finally struck up a conversation with a guy who I had seen there a handful of times, but had never talked to. And he said something like, oh yeah, my friends and I, we call you Robot Squat. And I laughed. I was like, why is that? It's like, because every rep looks the same no matter what the weight is.
That's the goal.
Yeah, I know. I was like, this is, wow, I've never thought about it, but this is great. So it's like, yeah, the technique itself should be the same for a squat or deadlift or bench press, whatever it might be. Just the speed of the lift should change based on how heavy it is. So I know I've digressed pretty far from the question as far as like how should novices feel about this, but kind of jumping back to like, what are some good guidelines they could give themselves for like how much should they be pushing themselves and things like that. Again, I'd say once the technique is there, then we could start trying to ask that question and experiment with answering it. Generally, I'd say if you maybe stick on like the 5 to 7 out of 10, like overall difficulty rating, might be a pretty good place to aim for. However, another thing I'll say that was kind of going back to my undergraduate thesis was there was one novice lifter. So just to kind of explain the protocol for everyone, we had individuals come in and go through little body weight dynamic warm up, and then go through 1 repetition maximum testing. And for a novice lifter, they had like some experience. They had done the lift, before, but they're not extremely well trained in it. But going through 1 repetition maximum testing for, someone who's still a novice, is really difficult to do because they don't know their capabilities that well. And they're actually not really good at giving feedback on how accurately at how much they had left in the tank. So, and just to kind of describe the scale again, so the scale is from 1 to 10, and 10 would mean no more repetitions could have been completed and you could not have done any more weight, true maximum effort. 9 means you think you could have done 1 more repetition, 8, 2 more repetitions, 7, 3 more repetitions, and so on. But 9.5 means you couldn't have done another repetition, but you think you could have added a little bit more weight. So there's still some 0.5 increments kind of in there. And one of the novice lifters, after a 1 repetition max attempt, he successfully gets in, he racks the weight. I go, okay, so what was your RPE, or rating of perceived exertion? And he goes, oh, that was really difficult. That was a 10. And he moved it real fast. It looked smooth, looked like he was super in control. And I was like, are you sure? And he goes, yeah, that was really tough. That was a 10. And I finally kind of, we had the scale printed out so they could actually look at it and see the descriptions for each rating. And I point to the scale and I go, so you don't think you could have done any more weight or any more repetitions? And he finally looks at the scale and goes, that was an 8. Right. So he went from that was just maximum effort to, I think I could have done 2 more repetitions. So what was funny about this was, it's like kind of being in a novice state, as soon as something feels the least bit difficult, people are really quick to think, oh, that's the toughest thing ever, right? Or that's a maximum exertion I could have ever given, when that actually might not be the case. So I would say, especially for someone that's young, or I'm sorry, not young, but a novice when it comes to lifting, and it's hard to actually gauge some of that stuff, just try to think, all right, honestly, how many more reps do I think I could have done? Do I think I could have done a little bit more weight and actually kept my technique as ideal as possible? And those would probably be the best 2 questions to ask, guiding how to move forward.
That's great, because I think there's so much longevity in doing it correctly. And I think I'm in your boat too, because I'll be 32 next month, and I was so much stronger, I feel like, in my 20s, but not really. Like, I was just strong. And now that I lift weight, I'm like, I have to focus on form. So I have to drop my weight selection a little bit, because I have experienced so many injuries related to lifting and athletics and all that stuff. But typically when I coach too, I sort of have that same mindset where you have to teach people the fundamentals of movement patterns. And the ones that I like to go through are the squat, the hinge, which is basically just the bend at the hips, push and pull, and then rotation. Because I always like to think, like, if I'm in a survival setting, if I can just sit up once, if I can squat once, if I can pull myself up once, then I'm going to be able to evade the robber in my house. And so that's what I try to focus on. And I try to do that weightless. So just body weight, not added weight. And so that's the fundamentals that I like to think of. So do you like to focus on something like that, or are there other fundamentals that you like to coach?
Yeah. So kind of the first things I pretty much always start off with coaching most people, if they're, if they have like a baseline level of like capability and no injuries to kind of factor in, is I'll always first go over teaching how to breathe and brace the core. And then once you have that down, or kind of a pretty good grasping of that, I'll jump right into squat and deadlift. Usually with barbells, however, depending on how well someone's progressing, or if there's some something that maybe isn't clicking super well, I'll switch to a kettlebell as kind of a learning tool. But those are kind of the 3 things I'll always start with, is how to breathe and brace the core, and then how to squat and how to deadlift. And I think from there, I'll usually base most programs around squatting and deadlifting. And then for the lower body, and then for the upper body, I'll do something like a horizontal push and pull. So a bench press or seated cable row, or a bent over barbell row or dumbbell row, something like that. And then a vertical push and pull. So it could be just a barbell overhead press, dumbbell overhead press, or pull-ups or lat pull down.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
kind of like the basic, like 6 movement patterns. And then, if you want to throw lunges or something else that's like kind of one side of the body in there, you can definitely add a lot of flair to a program.
Yeah, make it spicy.
Yeah.
But so back to the first thing that you said, breathing and bracing is so important. I mean, so I remember a short story break. When I first lifted, I was in college because I played softball in college, and we had a strength and conditioning coach, but it was really just one of the players' boyfriends, and I didn't really know.
This is the best source of guidance you could have hoped for.
So funny. They didn't really teach us anything. So I remember when I went home for holiday break and I went to go lift, and Joey, I had 115 pounds on the bar and I was doing a squat, and I had no idea how to squat. First off, really, like I knew how to squat, but not with weight on my back. And I definitely did not know how to brace my core. So I went down into the squat. And then when I was coming up, the weight rolled over my traps and my back went completely arched. And I was so embarrassed. I had to drop the barbell on the little rails, and I was like, from here on out, I'm going to learn the correct technique. And then I matured into coaching and teaching group fitness myself, and there's just this one thing that always bothered me, which was to brace your core, you want to suck your belly button to your spine, because I'd heard multiple times before that if you want to think about it, if you suck your belly button to your spine, think about it like a soda can. So if a soda can collapses, is it going to be stronger or weaker? I mean, obviously it's going to be weaker because you're going to be able to crush it. There's no pressure. Where in powerlifting, you can definitely speak to this. You want to think about bracing by expanding as much as you can. So keeping the soda can full and then trying to put pressure on the full soda can. So it's like you breathe in a deep breath of air and then you squeeze your abs as tight as possible. And it just that cue that I don't even know where it started to suck your belly button to your spine just always got on my nerves. So how do you and what should you look for to start working on bracing your core effectively and breathing?
Sure. Yeah. Sucking your belly button to your spine is all too common of a cue. And yeah, I don't know where I got started either. But essentially, kind of when we brace our core, instead of sucking our belly button in our spine, we want to take a big breath and try to direct that increased pressure in our chest down towards our core. Now, what a lot of people, I'd say in another way, incorrectly coach kind of the other end of the spectrum, they'll say just push your gut out.
Mm,
And we don't want to do that exactly. So essentially, it's not uncommon for us to improperly engage our lower back muscles when we expand our abdomen so drastically, okay, or when we push our gut out. And then after lifting like that for 2 years, people suddenly start to wonder why their lower back irritates them. That's exactly what happened to me. That was one of my injuries when I was powerlifting. And then I finally learned how to brace pretty effectively, and it made all the difference. So I'd say the goal when we breathe and brace is to engage all our muscles in our core. So our abdomen in the front, our obliques on the sides, and our erectors in the back to stabilize our spine so that it is in a rigid, neutral position and can support a load and won't deviate from that position as we go through a squat or a deadlift, an overhead press, or any movement that is loading the spine.
mhm.
It's totally fine for all the joints around our spine to move, right? We need our hips and our shoulders to move as we do all these, these movements, but we want our spine as a unit to be rigid and neutral. So a lot of people can have some difficulty kind of understanding what that should feel like. If you were to kind of like squeeze your sides with your hands and kind of pinch the front of your core and the back with your index finger and your thumb, and you try to like breathe and brace your core, you should feel tension building on both sides. A lot of people, it can be really tough for them to feel it in the back at first. And again, this is breathing and bracing like that is in and of itself a skill that takes time to practice and train, and you will get better at it. One thing that can help, or some cue that I think helps people when they're not really feeling, or they don't really know what it should feel like, is if you were going to get punched in the gut and you knew it was coming, how would you prepare for that?
Yeah, I
Right.
would not prepare for it by sucking my belly button to my spine. It's
Yeah,
what I
exactly.
would do.
You wouldn't do that. You would not suck your gut in to your spine or anything. You wouldn't push your gut out as far as you can, right? It's kind of a natural, like almost instinctive tendency to just brace it and lock it in space where it is. This is kind of what's called the Valsalva maneuver. And essentially that's just when you take a breath to stabilize, to like increase your intrathoracic pressure, with the goal kind of usually being to stabilize your core overall. And this is actually something that humans instinctively do if they're going to lift something heavy. So if you think like, you're moving the couch with your dad and each of you is at one side of it and you go, okay, on 3, 1, 2, 3, and you both get that breath, and you've never been taught to breathe like that. You've never been taught to do that, but everyone kind of instinctively takes a breath and holds it. And it's because we know without knowing it, that is going to help stabilize our core pretty well. And then sometimes people don't focus on it when it comes to lifting, when you should definitely stabilize your core. And that's when things can kind of go awry.
Yeah. And I think that translates over into yoga too. We have this breath called Ujjayi breathing. So anytime that you go into the difficult part of a lift, which is typically, of course, the concentric part of the lift, when you exhale through a resisted throat. So you sort of like change the diameter of your throat. And so you're increasing the pressure in your midsection because you're not just breathing out through a non-resisted windpipe. So you keep everything engaged, and it helps you with things like balance and maintaining your strength and things like that. But yeah, definitely.
That's really cool. And that actually got me thinking of something else that I think is another very frequently coached miscue when it comes to breathing is, and usually, I'll have people come over to my garage to lift for the first time, and I go through breathing and then squatting and deadlifting, and especially if they maybe played high school sports or something, 2 things that they were almost always told was to like inhale on the way down and exhale on the way up, or exhale during the hard part of the lift, and then like look up when they're squatting and deadlifting.
Ugh, don't get me started on that.
Right. But when it comes to breathing, and the first thing I'll say is like, if someone coached you this, your experience, with collegiate softball, like someone can be a great coach for a sport, but that does not necessarily always translate over to being a great coach in the weight room. And what's all too common is people are taught, especially with squat or deadlift, that they should kind of inhale on the way down and exhale on the way up. And stuff like that is fine, I'd say, for maybe like bench press, or maybe just bench press. No, but like bench press, cable rows, stuff where you're not directly loading your spine, because the goal of our breath is to stabilize and support our spine, and we're constantly changing our breath throughout the movement, then we're either decreasing or increasing the stability of our spine. Whereas if we take a breath and hold it, and then say go down and up in a squat, the stability of our spine is not changing during that movement. And it's at a reliably rigid consistency. Whereas if we inhale on the way down and exhale on the way up, as soon as we come out of the bottom and start exhaling on the way up, we're decreasing the stability of our core.
Yeah. So I wish you were around to tell former Brittany that when I had 115 pounds on my back and I came up like a turtle. Gotta keep the pressure.
Exactly. For sure. So it's not, you might see people who they really forcefully exhale their breath coming out of the bottom of the squat, and then suddenly their core is not stable or strong enough in that position to support the weight, and then they go back down and fail. Yep. Now, what can happen, unfortunately, is, if we can't just hold our breath indefinitely, we need to, breathe. So sometimes people might feel a little lightheaded. I'd say usually that happens if you feel like you're holding almost like kind of what would intrinsically feel like the pressure of your breath, like almost in your throat or in your head. Again, you should not feel lightheaded when you do this. You should have all your breath down, like the pressure of it down kind of in your core. And then kind of when you get to the top of the lift, exhale, inhale, and basically reload at the top, go through the movement, reload at the top, go through the movement like that. But if we inhale on the way down and exhale on the way up, we're constantly changing how stable our core is. That can lead to injuries.
Mm-hmm. Well, on top of the breathing and bracing, are there any other things that you see are commonly taught incorrectly with weightlifting?
What I mentioned a second ago was head position and looking up when you squat and deadlift. This is something that I've actually in my current lab gained an even greater appreciation for. And so again, very common for high school sport coaches to teach looking up in those two lifts. And because I think the belief is if you look up, you'll go up. And then they also think that looking up kind of helps you arch your back a lot. Now, rounding your back, or almost like in a hunchback position, is not good when you lift, obviously. Arching your back, kind of going the other extreme, is not ideal still. We want our spine to be pretty straight and neutral throughout whatever movement we might be doing. So I'd say when it comes to our head position, we want our head to be facing in the same direction that our chest is oriented.
Mm.
So if we are about to deadlift and our torso should be kind of reclined over and our chest should kind of be at an angle face like pointed towards the ground, our head should be as well. So that essentially you almost want to do the robot with your head and chest oriented in the same directions at all times. This can be a really tough habit for people to break. One thing I'll do is if people come and lift and I'm trying to help them and they instinctively pick their head up right before they're about to deadlift, I'll just put my water bottle here right in front of them, like 2 feet in front of their feet, and I say, look at the water bottle, and then they kind of have to drop their head down, and then I tell them that once they get the bar past their knees, they can just look straight forward. Something like that is I'd say very, very common and a pretty tough habit to break, but it's definitely worth it in the long run. I'd say I should maybe explain why we don't want to do that. I left that out. So essentially, there are so I think the term like myofascial is like way overblown and overused by many people that might not completely understand what it is, but it's appropriate in the setting. So there are like myofascial like sheaths along our whole posterior chain, or the backside of our body. Okay. And so those are connective tissues that kind of span across different muscle groups. And if we change the tension in one muscle that those sheaths kind of span across, then that can actually have influence over the tension that can be generated in a muscle in a different region. So one example would be kind of like our lats actually have kind of interconnected myofascial sheaths with our glutes, with the contralateral glute. One thing that's pretty nuts is these sheaths can expand from the like our traps kind of go up the back of our neck, and they can span all the way up there through to our calf muscles. So what I think is all too common for people when they pick their head up is when you pick your head up, you actually are creating almost slack in these sheaths. Okay. And so they're not as tight as we would want them to be. And so when people pick their head up, they actually kind of naturally decrease the tension in their hamstrings. Now, when we say tension, some people might be like, oh, that sounds like a bad term, but no, you want tension in your muscles to lift correctly, right? And so with our glutes and hamstrings being huge prime movers for deadlift, if we decrease the tension in them, this is not good. Right? We want them to have tension, be able to move some weight. And then on top of that, if they have a decrease in tension, our lower backs seem to reciprocally like compensate by rounding a little bit.
The butt wink.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's sadly like I know way too many people who pick their head up and then have some type of injury in the lower back. And then usually once I help them and train them to keep their head in a neutral position throughout the movement, suddenly even slight irritations in the lower back go away. So yeah, it's interesting that whatever happens in our cervical spine, almost the reciprocal seems to happen in our lumbar spine. I don't know specifically biomechanically why that might be. I could ask my brother. He's an upper cervical specialist chiropractor, and he knows all the ins and outs of the spine biomechanics. But maybe I could reach out to him and get back to you on that.
For sure. In yoga, back to the yoga thing, we call that the like the kinetic chain or something. So in slower yoga practices like yin yoga, where you're holding postures, a lot of people outside of that, when you let's say do a hamstring stretch where you're standing and you're touching your toes, a lot of people will encourage you to soften your knees to take out the slack or like the effort, the stress in your lower back. But in yin yoga, when you're holding it for so long, because of that the kinetic chain and what you're talking about, the connection all the way from the back of your head down to your toes being one big sheath of tissue, if you have any, like you said, slack in that chain, you're going to lose the benefit of the full benefit of that stretch. So you want that whole sheath to be stretched to its max. So typically, like if you're sitting down, your legs are out in front of you, I'm hinging over my legs and I'm pulling on the top of my toes. So my toes are pulling back, my feet are pulling back, my legs are pinned straight, and my back is in some kind of curved position with my chin to my chest. So that whole kinetic chain is being stressed.
Yeah.
And
And
similar to lifting, like you said, if you have one little slack in that chain, you have a weakness somewhere else. So it's really important to maintain integrity of the spine so that everything else follows suit.
yeah, that sounds like an absolutely brutal stretch that would,
It's miserable. And you hold it for 2 to 10 minutes. Like,
I'd be closer to the 2 end of that, but and actually one thing I'll say is people can kind of feel this on themselves. So like if someone were to just kind of just stretch out one leg, like so essentially lock your knee, stretch it out, and then try to like pick your leg up like on a door frame or something. If you tuck your chin down, the sensation of the kind of intensity of that stretch would increase. Whereas if you pick your head up, the intensity seems to ease a little bit. And that's exactly what happens with that. And that's exactly kind of what we want to avoid when lifting and we have some external load that we're supposed to support. And so
yeah.
if we're not supporting it with these muscles that we're supposed to, that are, should bear the brunt of the load, some other muscle or some poor soul joint in our spine is going to bear that load, and that's when we're most susceptible to getting injured usually.
Yeah, I love it. I could talk about mechanics of lifting all day, but we don't have time. So back to novices, I find that people that are coming into weightlifting or exercise, we have a big problem, of course, with obesity. And so a lot of people are aware that they need to change up their habits. And I'm afraid that a lot of overweight and obese individuals are recommended to do things more like cardio-based activities because people think that, relatively speaking, I burn more calories during that than I do with weight training. But the thing that I've learned also is that just from an absolute scale, if you look at weight training and overweight and obese versus normal weight people, is that they tend to be stronger because they have more absolute muscle mass. Now, whether it's like more muscle quality is not part of that question, but because they, like you said before, more muscle moves more weight, they tend to be more successful in weightlifting. And then on top of that, there's so many benefits to weightlifting for weight loss. So can you talk about whether this population should be incorporating some kind of resistance exercise for weight loss,
Yeah.
and your knowledge?
Yeah. So I'll say I'm not super, the expert on the research on this or anything. But I would say I think the most important aspect for gaining and losing weight is diet. Essentially, if you're not in a caloric deficit, meaning someone's not eating fewer calories than their body uses as energy every day, then they won't be losing weight. Now, with that said, yes, many overweight people take a liking to lifting weights because they're usually stronger on an absolute level than individuals who are not overweight and are also beginning resistance training for the first time. But there's this concept out there that we should just do cardio exercise if we want to lose weight and that lifting weights won't help. You can still burn a tremendous amount of calories lifting weights. It's largely based on how much exertion you put into it. So 30 minutes of lifting weights with a high level of effort can certainly burn more calories than 20 minutes of low intensity cardio training. It's all relative. And people who are primarily concerned with losing weight should not worry that resistance training will inevitably make weight loss more difficult for them or impossible. I'm currently helping a friend whose main goals are weight loss and eventually training for a triathlon. And I have him cycling and running 6 days a week. And 2 days a week, I have him lifting weights. And it's been great because not only is he making progress losing weight, he's getting better at running and cycling in the meantime, and he's getting stronger, kind of all simultaneously, which is pretty fun to see.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love it. Well, let's move into the next section, which is the strength adaptations to lifting. And I know that this is your bread and butter, so I'm really excited to talk about this. But I do remember back in the day, in all my years of learning about anatomy and physiology, that they really do stress the muscle fiber types thing. So what composition that you're made of with like the fast twitch versus the slow twitch muscle fibers, and that composition is going to end up benefiting you in some way over another composition. So I understand that you know this to not be the case. So I would love to hear your knowledge on this topic. But can you start first by defining what I mean by muscle fiber types a little bit better?
Yeah, sure. So there are three basic types of human skeletal muscle fibers: type 1, type 2A, and type 2B. And they each have different characteristics determining how an individual muscle fiber that falls under one of those groups will behave in terms of like contraction intensity and energy utilization. Um, and that can kind of determine that individual muscle fibers like contraction strength and endurance capabilities. And there are also several classifications of hybrid muscle fiber types, and our proportion of muscle fiber types can change slightly with training, as well as being sedentary and with aging. Now, what I'm about to say is going to be considered absolute heresy to exercise physiologists or muscle
About to
physiologists.
make people mad.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it was something that when I first learned of it from my current PhD mentor, I was skeptical. And then I listened to the case he made and I thought, yeah, that's pretty convincing. And I won't be able to dive all the way into the case because there's a little more to it than we might have time for. But essentially, the prevailing thought for a long time now is whatever proportional breakdown of muscle fiber types you're born with will largely determine your athletic abilities.
Mhm.
With the thinking being that people with a high proportion of type 1, or what are termed slow twitch fibers, will be better at long distance running or cycling, basically any type of endurance training. And people with a higher proportion of type 2, or what are termed fast twitch fibers, will be better suited for lifting weights and kind of any type of explosive activity. And conceptually, this makes sense. It makes complete sense to assume that whatever's happening kind of on this individual muscle fiber level that determines its characteristics would probably scale into how it could influence overall athletic capabilities. However, I think this is a little too simple. And I believe the role that muscle fiber types play in determining athletic abilities has been largely overblown. One reason for this is that pennation angle, or the orientation of muscle fiber direction relative to how the muscle will pull on a bone, varies greatly between people. So essentially, the same muscle for different people could have wildly different, not widely different, but pretty different pennation angles. And that influences how a muscle functions overall. An example of this would actually be that the tibialis anterior muscle, so a muscle in the lower leg that,
The shin splints muscle. Shin
yeah,
splints muscle.
exactly.
Yeah.
So if you were to do dorsiflexion and pick your toes up, that's a primary muscle moving that for that joint motion. The tibialis anterior is one of the largest muscles with the smallest proportion of type 2 fibers, but is one of the fastest contracting muscles in the body.
Huh.
It kind of says like, okay, well, it's predominantly type 1 fibers, but it has a much faster contraction overall, contraction time than most other big muscles in the body. So why is that? So it kind of already suggests that there's a little more at play here than just muscle fiber types. And then another reason, and this was actually discovered some years ago with frog muscles, is that every muscle fiber transmits about roughly 75% of its force laterally onto other muscle fibers through connective tissues. Okay. So any individual muscle fibers contractile characteristics that determine the force generation for that muscle fiber, those will be highly diluted when the whole muscle is taken into account. So if you have these, type 1 and type 2 fibers kind of all intermixed, well, if let's say experimentally, if any one of them were to contract, it would actually transmit some of that force laterally onto other muscle fibers. And so when that's happening, for every single muscle fiber in a muscle, it's going to really degrade that individual muscle fiber and its type's contribution to the global muscle function. So And then kind of another thing is that like most people could make remarkable progress in any type of training that they really commit to, regardless of their muscle fiber type composition.
Yeah, and I think we're just adaptation machines. So to piggyback off of your last comment, I mean, right, you can train to be anything. You see this, you can simplify it as much like you look at actors. Actors can train to look huge like the Hulk or to look anorexic like somebody with some kind of health issue. And so, yeah, your body has this crazy ability to adapt. And I think that's so interesting that we're taught so much as exercise physiologists that muscle fiber type matters, but there's more to that equation.
There is, and I think the reason it's taught and so widespreadly taught like that is it's very simple
Yeah.
to teach and to think about, and without kind of diving into the details I mentioned and several others that are really, really important factors.
Yeah.
It just keeps it simple and easy to learn. It's like, oh yeah, type 1, you're going to be really good at running long distances. But you know,
Yeah.
not it's not a perfect kind of description for how we actually perform athletically.
I think that's great. That's great. Well, another thing with strength adaptations is that with strength training, your muscles become physically bigger, which is known as hypertrophy. And the thing about that is that I realize being in fitness, especially fitness with women, is that that kind of thing definitely scares women away from weight training because they think that if they get under the bar, they're going to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger and they're never going to come back. And so, but what I try to tell these women is that first off, it's really difficult to train to the level that people like Arnold Schwarzenegger train to get those type of adaptations. And as women, we're not suited with the hormones that are needed to be able to grow like that. And so it's never going to happen. But the other thing is that in addition to growing muscle mass, which you will do, you're also highly improving muscle quality, which there's tons of definitions for it, but it's like you're improving the sensitivity of your brain to the muscle, you're improving things like mitochondrial concentrations and number and all these things. And so it's so important to stress the muscle quality thing over just growing muscle mass to avoid the fear of women in strength training. So can you talk a little bit about this and how to help women in this area?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a pretty good preface. And I do think that this is one of my I think one of the funnier like concerns that many women have, as if it's so easy to accidentally become super jacked and humongous. You know, like, oh, I lifted weights once and now I'm so strong. It's like, if it was that easy, everyone would do it. And it's like, it actually takes a lot of really hard work to get bigger, right? But I would say I do understand why many women would be concerned about this. And my suspicion is it's probably because they have seen some women who look freakishly muscular, to the point where they almost no longer look feminine. And I know maybe kind of jumping into that type of like body image like statement would offend some people, but I think that at least from the way many women would view this, that they would agree with that. And so if that's the case, this would make lifting weights kind of intimidating for women who want to remain appearing feminine and however they view that to be. And I want to make something, I guess, really clear, and that's, if you see a woman who is so muscular that she resembles an extremely muscular man, then she is likely taking steroids. So like
Probably also has a deep voice and a square jaw. Definite
yeah, exactly,
indicator.
and beard on top of that, right? So an overwhelming majority of women cannot naturally get this muscular, right? Maybe there's one or two outliers who can, but that they're by far the anomaly. You're probably not it. And so unless a woman plans to start simultaneously taking steroids while she begins lifting weights, she's not going to become that bulky and muscular to the point where she'd be upset she started lifting weights in the first place. And actually, one thing I'll say is that many women that I've trained and helped, like, that's a very common and, again, understandable concern they have. And I think they realize that once they actually start lifting weights and pushing themselves and actually start to get stronger and actually start to add a little bit more muscle to their body, they are really happy, and they actually feel even more feminine and more confident in their body, kind of beyond what they would have expected, which I think is just besides just like improving your capabilities, your physical capabilities to like help people in the event of an emergency, being stronger, that's always great. But like, it's always awesome to have a side effect of people just feeling more confident about how their body looks, and whether that's becoming more masculine if you're a man. And I think for many women, surprisingly, they feel like they look more feminine once they start lifting weights, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah. And to that point, I always have to remind people too. I'm like, if you go on social media, Instagram, whatever you look at, if you're looking at through pictures and images of women that have bodies that you sort of like and that you think are appealing, I guarantee you that they're doing primarily strength training, some kind of resistance exercise. They obviously they have a clean diet, but it's like they're not doing as much cardio as you think you need to optimize your body composition.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, definitely. I think, and I think that like where, most women like to have kind of curves in certain places and not in others. And generally, once we start lifting weights, it adds the curves to the places most women want them to be,
yep,
which is always, a great side effect.
definitely a bonus. Not great for buying jeans, but great bonus.
Yeah, exactly. You'll likely notice a difference in the way your clothes are fitting for the better.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah.
that's funny. And so, and I know you like to talk about this topic too. Another one of the strength adaptations is this like brain muscle connection. So what's going on with how the brain's talking to the muscle neuromuscularly, your nervous system. So can you talk a little bit about some of the adaptations there with strength training?
Yeah, some. Sadly, I'm not too familiar with the brain's role in how our muscles work. I'm a little more knowledgeable on kind of the middleman between the brain and muscles, which is motor neurons.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's what I mean, by the way.
no
Yeah.
worries. And I mean, like, there's I'm sure plenty of other research that are actually like doing some scans of the brain and stuff after maybe before and after people lift weights. I'm not sure, but yeah. So essentially, what's happening kind of on the neurological side before our muscles actually have anything happen to them. So I guess one thing I could expand on that I think is really cool is that some Belgian researchers, who are actually colleagues of my PhD mentors, assessed what is happening neurologically when humans undergo explosive movement training. So specifically, that would be looking at what happens with certain in this study, certain leg muscles after repeated training of powerful rapid contractions. So very rapid contraction, and then the muscle very quickly after relaxes. Okay. So what was pretty cool is they discovered that the nerves controlling the antagonist muscle, and what that is kind of a muscle that would create an opposing force relative to whatever the target muscle is. So if we think our biceps and our triceps, they would be antagonistic muscles for each other because they create forces in opposite directions around the elbow joint. Uh, so what they discovered was the nerves controlling those antagonist muscles had their activity inhibited more from the training, so that the antagonist muscle would then relax more during a rapid contraction of the agonist target muscle. So I know that was kind of like a lot of a runaround way that anyone listening to this is probably like, that was really annoying to listen to. But to kind of give you an example, if we underwent very explosive power training for our biceps, then our triceps, not only would our biceps get stronger and with the neural connections to our biceps get more efficient to actually evoke powerful explosive contractions, but we'd actually also get better at relaxing our triceps in that exact same moment, so that there's less force opposing our biceps from undergoing the joint movement they want them to create, or we want them to create. So essentially we get better at controlling the muscles we want to and relaxing the muscles we don't want to be active with certain types of training.
Which is crazy because I never would have, I mean, I know that style, that part of physiology, but to think about that as a training benefit of weight training and power training and all that stuff is crazy. And I mean, it does make sense in, like a survival situation. If you're more fit, your body's going to do anything it can to be able to effectively move. And so if you do survival situation, need to bicep curl, if I'm more fit or more trained, then all of my everything around it is going to be optimized. So that's pretty interesting. I like that.
Yeah. It's kind of like affecting other muscles than we would have maybe initially thought it could,
Yeah.
for global benefit of overall, joint functionality.
Yeah. And there's circling back a little bit to muscle quality too. I know we touched on a bunch of things, but is there anything else that improves with muscle quality with weight training that you know about?
I guess I'll admit that the term kind of muscle quality is a little new to me, and I'm kind of like you said, it can almost like a catch-all phrase that many people think will use that term for almost any description of the muscle. I guess the one thing I'd say to that is I kind of going back to like what are some good sources of information, what are some bad ones for people just getting into this stuff would be maybe try to steer clear of companies that say they will help you build lean muscle. As if muscle can sometimes be fat muscle. Uh, so muscle is muscle and fat is fat, and the two do not convert between each other. Now, as we get older, it's possible for fat to grow into space previously occupied by muscle, but that's a concept and phenomenon that these fitness companies are not thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
I would say like essentially just we can get bigger muscles, and we can become better at controlling the muscles that we do have. Also, one thing on top of that is to say that whenever anyone says that they want to tone, usually when kind of thinking back to women being nervous about like getting bulky, they'll say, "Oh, I don't want to get bulky, I want to tone." What they mean, even without realizing it, is that they want to build muscle and simultaneously usually you lose fat. So I think that sadly both of these terms between like toning and lean muscle become kind of catch-all phrases for simply getting stronger.
Yeah.
Uh, but they seem a little more attractive and are good for marketing. So it kind of seems like more desirable outcomes for people. But I would say like just think that whenever you're going to lift weights or something, you want to get stronger. You can do that neurologically by just in more or less ways getting better neurological control of your muscles, and then beyond that you can also obviously get bigger muscles that you not only have kind of a bigger not a more efficient engine, but then a bigger engine to work with.
Yeah. So important for women, especially to hear that. But let's do one more question. And I'm really interested in it, obviously, because I've mentioned yoga already 15 times. But stretching, I always say, is my favorite part of a workout. I don't even care. I'll spend like 10 to 15 minutes every workout stretching. It's part of my cool down. I can just mentally relax. But the adaptations to stretching are pretty cool. And I know you've mentioned in previous conversations that basically you've debunked all of my knowledge in this area. I always thought, just like in traditional teaching of exercise physiology, you think that flexibility means your muscle itself is just getting longer, right? And I always thought that, but apparently that's not the case. And I would love you to school me on this area of what happens when you do flexibility training.
Right. So again, this is something that I'm not. Again, I'm not the expert. I don't want to commit the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Where I just know enough that then I think I know everything, but I really know nothing. So I know I'll say that I've been surprised by a few things that I have learned that have really changed my thinking on flexibility since I started my PhD. So and I'll also say that kind of the research on flexibility and like adaptations is not necessarily all over the place, but there's no like very clear consensus. But some things I think are likely contributors to there's this like idea out there that like lifting weights will make you less flexible and stuff. I think that usually what happens is when people start spending more time lifting weights, they spend less time training flexibility.
Mm.
And flexibility, like strength, is something that you can practice and train and get better at, right? So if you're diverting your time away from flexibility training, you'll probably become less flexible. If you divert your time and effort away from strength training, you'll probably become weaker. So one thing I'll say as far as like when we become more flexible, we are, I'd say, almost certainly not creating any difference in muscle or tendon tissue stiffness. And we are actually increasing our stretch tolerance. So that can be not only our cognitive recognition of how of the sensation of stretching and kind of how irritating it can be, right? Especially doing 15 minutes of it over here. But well, actually, probably by like minute 5, you're like, oh, this feels nice now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So not only like our cognitive recognition of it, but almost on an unconscious recognition of how we can actually influence some of the neurons at play. So what I mean by that is that our muscles are constantly receiving a low baseline level of excitatory information from our nervous system through those motor neurons I mentioned earlier. So that low consistent baseline level can never be fully turned off, only lessened to a certain extent. It could actually be fully turned off if someone either dies or there's like anesthesia or someone becomes paralyzed. Okay, and the actual neural connection there along the track from the brain to the muscle is severed somewhere or blocked somewhere. Okay, so when we stretch a muscle, that muscle receives more excitatory information through reflex pathways and resists the stretch more and more as the stretch progresses.
It's a
Okay, right?
protective mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. As you stretch and go through a kind of a larger range of motion, as that range of motion increases, the intensity becomes like even more and more unbearable and terrible, right?
Yeah.
So when we become more flexible, we are essentially decreasing that amount of reflexive excitatory information the muscles would otherwise be receiving, which results in the muscle generating less resistance as it's being stretched through a range of motion. Okay, or a joint is taken through a range of motion. Now, a lot of people are skeptical of this, which is understandable. Nothing against yoga or like physical therapists, but they might not necessarily know kind of the research behind this. And like, I totally didn't until I got to my lab and started reading it. They're understandably skeptical and are probably pretty convinced that we do create a long-lasting change in the actual length of muscle fibers or tendons or connective tissue through flexibility training. Now, I think if that was the case, it would be very difficult to accurately control our muscles as a result of that deformed length, right? If we are creating like an actual change in the material elasticity of these tissues, well, then that's actually going to be harder for us to know how to control our joints because it's at a completely new length than it was before. Also, there's some researchers that tested the hamstring flexibility of patients on operating tables just before and after the administration of anesthesia. And when they were unconscious after the anesthesia set in, the patients were drastically, almost comically more flexible than before anesthesia set in, right? So there was no change in no flexibility training and no change in the muscle length, right? So the reason for this is the anesthesia completely cuts off the excitatory information reaching the muscle, so it will have no reflexive resistance to stretching, right? So if it was the material properties, then we would have expected it to be just as resistive to going through stretching than if it was more of on the neurological side of things, right?
Yeah. It's so
So
interesting.
so I think that like what's pretty nuts about it is it's just like this means that it's not the material elastic properties of muscles and tendons that is the limiting factor for human flexibility. It's not only our conscious perception of it, but our unconscious neurological circuitry that is going to affect how muscles are behaving. I would say actually a similar example that I read a few years ago on some like forum for surgeons. I have no idea how I ended up there, but I did in the surgeon. But one of the surgeons recalled how he had a patient come into the operating room with extreme thoracic kyphosis. And for anyone listening who might not know what that is or is unfamiliar with that term, kyphosis is when you have a prominent outward curvature of the spine. So if it's in your thoracic spine or kind of your upper back, you like, I don't like using this term, but you can think of like a hunchback. And this gentleman had it to such a bad degree that when he was standing up, his face was almost like parallel to the floor.
Wow.
He was like really down, right? Pretty unfortunate situation. But what was pretty crazy was when they got him on the operating table, the surgeon said that this patient's head was resting at a full foot above the table,
Oh my
right? And that
gosh.
was laying down, right? What's even crazier is when they gave him anesthesia to like completely relax him. The kyphosis, or the curvature in his spine, lessened more and more and more and more until his head was against the table and his body had completely relaxed, and he looked like any other person just lying down, right? So why did this happen? My thought, knowing what I know now, and then when I actually thought back to reading the story, is that this the gentleman with this kyphosis probably had chronically elevated excitatory information going to the muscles in his abdomen, or somewhere along kind of his anterior portion of his thoracic cavity. And so that would kind of naturally cause him to bend forward and round his back out so drastically if there's so much excitatory information that he actually can't even not only notice that it's happening, but like resist it. And then once the anesthesia set in and completely blocked that excitatory information from reaching those muscles, and they started to relax, then his body actually went into like normal kind of biomechanical state that most people's would be in, which I thought was just so crazy to think about, that it really, we could tell this guy like, oh, you just need to stretch out your abdomen, right? But which could help, but it could be very tough for some people, and it kind of, something like that kind of opened my eyes that I think it's way more on a neurological level than it is just a tissue material elasticity level for most flexibility phenomenon.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I mean, it makes sense because your muscle, sort of like you alluded to, has this resting muscle tone, is what we call it, or muscle tonicity, which is directly related to the neuro innervation of it. And so it's like when you're doing flexibility training, sort of to recap, you're basically saying that your muscle is becoming less sensitive, I guess, to the protective effects that are normally there. So normally, like if you're less flexible, your body's going to be doing anything it can to prevent that muscle from going longer. So when you
Mm-hmm.
do flexibility training, your body starts to like calm down and not be on such high alert, and you don't
Yeah.
have that.
Yeah. One kind of, at least one known neurological kind of circuitry that I know can affect that is essentially like we can consciously almost override some reflexive responses. So with training, and then be consciously knowing we're going through flexibility, we almost override information that would cause motor neurons to create whatever muscle we're stretching to contract and resist that stretch. You can override that and essentially negate that excitatory information, or lessen at least the amount of excitatory information that eventually reaches the muscle, almost even consciously. So not just the scenarios where people are under anesthesia, but this is something we can consciously train, which
Yeah.
is pretty nuts.
And back to the yin yoga where you're holding poses for that long, that's the sole basis of it. And I didn't even think about this, but you're holding that pose for so long because typically, I don't know what the actual numbers are, but a lot of research has shown that in the first, up to a minute of a stretch, your body has all these mechanisms that are being employed to prevent the stretch. So basically, your body's working against you trying to stretch. And so the longer that you stay in that stretch, the more your body relaxes. So things like the Golgi tendon apparatus that is just firing up to try to prevent the separation of your muscle and the tendon, that's starting to sort of relax and be taken out of the equation. And so you can stretch a little further into that posture. But it does, like you said, you can train it. You just have to
I was
relax
just
and
saying with
breathe.
like muscle spindles in 1A afferents.
Yeah.
It's kind of like
Yeah.
the big, like that's the stretch reflex cycle right there. And that's kind of like you were just saying with the Golgi tendon organ, that's essentially being overridden in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. So cool. Love it. Love it. Well, this was so informative, and I am incredibly happy to be able to reconnect. It's been so long since I've seen you and caught up a little bit. But
For sure. I'm so glad I randomly called you like a month or two ago to catch up, and then here we
yeah. Yeah, and I still need to look into that website that you said you told me before, but um I'm really grateful for you being on, and if you have any questions for Joey, you can always reach out to me on any of my social media platforms and I'll be able to reach out to Joey for you. But again, thanks Joey so much for being here, and I look forward to chatting with you in the future.
For sure. It's been a real pleasure, Britt. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Hey guys, I am so excited for my new book entitled Through His Strength by Improving Ours, Family, to be released on February 4th. This book has been strategically designed to educate parents and caretakers on what the Bible and research have to say about exercise and nutrition. And then after they soak in all that good information, they will rally the family troops and complete discussion questions and fun practical application activities. To learn more about my new book, visit my website at www.drbrittanyRallman.com. That's www.drbrittanyRallman.com.